So in one of my recent videos, I talked about all the issues that are going on inside USA Curling right now. And towards the end of that video, I talked about how these issues were probably going to come to a head, or at least be discussed, at the USA Curling Members Assembly, which indeed was held virtually on Friday, October 21st. Now, very helpfully, USA Curling has posted a summary of what went on at the meeting. And I guess we can just read that and have a pretty good idea of what's going on. So here's the recap of the 2022 Members Assembly virtual meeting, which was streamed, as it says, on USA Curling's YouTube channel. The assembly was a welcomed opportunity to speak directly with membership, as over 80 delegates brought comments, questions, concerns, and dialogue to the table. And it goes on to talk about how in a 2/3 vote, the Members Assembly did ratify the Board of Directors' unanimous vote to remove the GNCC as a member region. And it goes on from there, but that's basically all they talk about. Oh, also in saying that members agreed to begin Governance 4.0, which will be a comprehensive revision to ensure USA Curling's bylaws best serve the mission of the organization and its members. So, great recap. I guess that wraps up this video. We now all understand what happened at the Members Assembly. Thank you for coming. Okay, not really. This is obviously a very, very short summary of what was a 4.5-hour long meeting. And it neglects to talk about exactly how the meeting went, what was discussed, how it was discussed, and just as importantly, what wasn't discussed. So instead of this very short and inadequate recap, let's talk about what really happened at the USA Curling Members Assembly and get into some of the details of what went down. We have to start the story a bit before the assembly began. At one point in the lead up to the assembly, there was a document produced in which the USA Curling Board said they were adjusting Robert's Rules of Order because they expected the meeting to go long and wanted it to finish at a reasonable hour. The most significant changes were that debate on any one topic was to be limited to an hour, and that each delegate, of which there were going to be over 80 because every at-large club had at least one representative in this meeting, each delegate would be limited to just 30 seconds of discussion and debate on any topic until everyone got to speak, and then those delegates could potentially get a second chance to speak if everyone had had their piece. I'm not privy to the specifics of any discussions on the rules, and what information I do have was secondhand, but by the time the meeting came around, the rules had been shifted again. Delegates now had up to 10 minutes to talk about the current topic up for debate. So that promised to make the meeting go very long. I was anticipating this would go well after midnight, and while I was kind of correct, not as correct as I thought I would be, as we'll get to as we get towards the end of this meeting. So that brings us to the Members Assembly, which began at 7:30 p.m. on Friday night Eastern Time with the call to order. Actually, that didn't happen at 7:30 p.m. because, well, the meeting was held using Microsoft Teams, and anyone who's familiar with doing meetings by Microsoft Teams know it isn't the easiest and most intuitive way to hold a meeting, especially a large one. Sure enough, there were a host of technical problems early on, and if you tuned in early for the live stream on YouTube, this is basically what you saw. As I posted on the Reddit thread about this meeting, the beeps were definitely the highlight of the beginning. Some people said it at least gave them a way to calibrate their audio. So, eventually those problems were resolved, but kind of a portent of things to come for the rest of the night. Now, after Chair Lynn LaRocca did convene the meeting, calling it to order, she then appointed a parliamentarian, and then we moved on to the first controversial part of the meeting: the certification of votes, the roll call, and the determination of quorum. many of you watching this may already be aware, there was an issue with how votes were being delegated to clubs throughout the United States. USA Curling's policy, which has apparently been consistent for many years now according to delegates, but doesn't make it any more fair or sensible, is that if you do not get your club's membership dues in by January 31st, you will not have votes for those members who are unpaid at the members' assembly, despite the fact that it does not happen until the following fall. This is despite the fact that all these clubs are members in good standing of USA Curling, so there's no dispute over whether or not these clubs are legitimate and have a place at the members' assembly. However, that means they have no or few votes, because in some cases there were clubs that had one vote or a handful of votes, presumably because some individual members had paid before that deadline. This, of course, led to immediate debate within the members' assembly, with multiple delegates trying to bring up this issue before the roll call was taken and before quorum was determined. I am not an expert on parliamentary procedure, and I've heard various things from various people. However, there were many delegates trying to make the point that they wanted to deal with this issue before quorum was called in an attempt to make sure that the voting numbers were correct before we determined if we had a quorum. From the USA Curling Board's perspective, the issue was they wanted to have quorum determined before any of these issues were discussed. In either case, we did get quorum determined and a roll call taken first, and then this issue came to a head again. And while USA Curling stuck to its policy, there was one particular situation that stood out from the rest. Broomstones, the curling club in Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, had presumably postmarked their dues payment to the USA Curling Board on January 31st, which is the deadline. It did not arrive at the USA Curling offices until afterwards, of course. But the argument from Broomstones was that in almost any scenario, in any context, the date of postmark is typically used to determine whether something was received on time in any official capacity. After some debate on this issue, it was determined that Broomstones would get its over 400 votes back, and the meeting was able to move on. Now, as the meeting continued, we had two reports that were given, three in total, but two in particular that I want to focus on. First, we had the report of the chair of board of directors given by LaRocca herself. I would describe this as listening to it as Terry Silver-esque for any of you who are familiar with either Cobra Kai or Karate Kid Part 3, and in particular the speech he gives at the end of Karate Kid Part 3, where he talks to the assembled crowd at the All Valley Karate Tournament and telling them how Cobra Kai wants to teach karate for all the right reasons and teach all the best virtues of self-defense and discipline, while Daniel LaRusso and Mr. Miyagi look on horrified, knowing the truth of the organization.
USA Curling is used as a model of exemplary NGB governance within the USOPC. These strides were made possible by this staff under the leadership of CEO Jeff Plush. Their professionalism in running and governing this sport as a business these past few years is nothing short of inspiring. They have built the foundation so the child seeing the sport for the first time can be inspired to learn and grow through a strong, solid, and safe curling pipeline.
Together, we are about to open a chain of Cobra Kai dojos, where young people can come and learn the same values I've learned. Honesty, compassion, and fair play. Thank you all for coming.
But yeah, she basically talked about how great things have been under Jeff Plush and how well the board and Jeff have steered USA Curling over the recent months and years. That was followed up by the CEO's report, which came from Jeff Plush himself. Plush spent a lot of his report basically defending himself from the outcry that has come from USA Curling's membership over the last few weeks. He pointed to the fact that there's only one incident in the Yates report that was reported to him, and that he did report it up the chain of command to USA Soccer and so on, and that coach was fired within a week. This is similar to the defense we saw when the information about the phone call he had with USA Curling's staff was leaked recently. That phone call happened a year ago after this investigation, the Yates investigation began, and that the story was first reported by The Athletic, and that there was first an outcry about the issues happening in the National Women's Soccer League. As was pointed out by delegates later, this statement didn't cover everything about this story, of course. Plush neglected to talk about how the coach in question was then rehired by other teams, that he didn't do anything to prevent that from happening, and in some cases seemed to not even warn those teams about the previous incidents. There is, of course, plenty of debate to be had over what he could have done, but again, we're not even talking about that, which is a lot of the issue. Then after Dean Gemmell gave a report on member development, which he himself admitted was not going to be the highlight of the evening, we moved on to considering some new clubs for USCA membership and the election of new USCA directors. That all went without incident for the most part, because it was all leading into agenda item number 12, ratification of the USA Curling Board's action of July 26, 2022, regarding the Grand National Curling Club. For those who were not aware or need to catch up, USA Curling has been in a dispute with the Grand National Curling Club, the GNCC, over the last couple of years. The crux of the issue is as follows. USA Curling essentially wants its regional members, including the GNCC, to ensure that all of its member clubs in turn are members of both the Regional Association and the National Governing Board. There was a policy change to make it so that only 95% of members of the regional clubs had to be paid up to USA Curling, in an attempt to at least prevent a single club from hijacking that process. But the GNCC had fallen well below that mark over the past year. One thing that bothered a lot of people at this meeting, and I think is a legitimate concern, even if it wasn't a deciding factor in this case, because I think everyone could agree that the GNCC had fallen below a 95% threshold in reality, was the fact that there seemed to be differing estimates or figures of how the USA Curling staff had come up with what percentage of memberships were paid in the GNCC. We heard different estimates throughout the night. We heard that the number was calculated both on reports given from clubs to USA Curling membership, as well as numbers from the prior year if new numbers weren't available, which made some people say that this was essentially an estimate and people were kicking out the GNCC based on an estimate. I don't think that's a perfectly fair characterization, but it at least questions how accurate these numbers are. Like, they are real numbers, so I don't think calling it an estimate is fair because they are using real numbers, but the validity of those numbers is still in question. So that's really semantics. Either way, there is definitely a question about their validity. In any case, as a result of this shortfall and the fact that the GNCC is now allowing clubs to join their regional organization without any obligation to join USA Curling, USA Curling took the step of removing the Grand National Curling Club as a member region of the national organization. However, that action had to be confirmed at the members' assembly by a 2/3 vote. As you might expect, there was a lot of heated discussion at this point. Most of it coming from delegates who represented GNCC clubs or delegates from clubs who were sympathetic to the GNCC's position here. Going through all the arguments that were made would take way too much time for this video, which, as long as it's going to be, at least won't be 4.5+ hours like the meeting was. One of the big points that was made, though, was that nobody disputed that the board could take the action it did. However, the statutes in question say that the board may remove the regional organization, not that it must. And the point that a lot of people made was, okay, even if the board is within its right to do this, and even if USA Curling feels that the GNCC is not in compliance, there's no reason that they have to remove the GNCC quickly rather than look for other solutions. And this is basically how I feel, and I'm getting a little off of just recapping the meeting here, but I think, and in private conversations with individual stakeholders in the GNCC, many agree that it's not as though the USA Curling underlying position has no merit whatsoever. They can have concerns about one of their regional organizations representing clubs that are not within the USA Curling. Then sure, there's something there, right? It is a little bit of an odd situation in a sense, but that doesn't mean you have to immediately remove the regional organization, the GNCC in this case. It causes so many headaches administratively and potentially for competitive athletes, which we will talk about a bit more in a minute, that even if this was going to be the long-term outcome, and it might not have had to have been, but even if it was going to be, you would think for everyone's benefit, you'd push for a longer-term negotiated separation that makes sure there's continuity for all curlers and that everyone feels they still have a voice at the table within USA Curling, that representation is guaranteed for everyone, that clubs don't feel they have to make immediate decisions, and so on. But that's not what happened. And at this meeting, discussion was pretty abruptly cut off when a motion was made to call the question. Now, as people have brought up, this probably is okay under Robert's Rules of Order. However, the rules that were laid out by USA Curling made a point of saying that all delegates would get a chance to speak. And by cutting things off, there were many delegates who had had their hand raised as throughout the meeting. And when I say hands raised, I mean in Microsoft Teams. This was the method that was agreed upon by which delegates would look to be recognized and called upon to speak. Unfortunately, throughout the meeting, there were many, many times where delegates either never got to speak or were not called upon until well after the issue they wished to speak about had been, well, in a sense, resolved or at least moved past in the meeting. In the end, the motion passed, and without looking it up immediately, I did not write down the exact numbers. There was something like over 13,000 votes to remove the GNCC and over 5,000 to override the board's decision. Voting against the GNCC or voting to remove the GNCC included the Regional Association for the State of Wisconsin, the Regional Association for the State of Minnesota, in a split vote, some of the Mountain Pacific MOPAC region, the MACA region, which is the Mid-America region, the Midland region, the Great Lakes region, the Dakota Territory, the Copper Country Curling Club, the Wine Country Curling Club out of California, and then the AAC, the Athletes Advisory Council. The Athletes Advisory Council, which was represented by Rich Rahonen at this meeting. Some of you may better know Rich as either a competitive curler or someone who likes to yell at Blake Griffin at basketball games, is a group that is supposed to represent athletes within USA Curling. And there is a similar organization in every Olympic sport overseen by the U.S. Olympic Paralympic Committee. By law and by U.S. OPC policy, this group has a third of the vote in any sort of board meeting or members' assembly in USA Curling or any of these other Olympic organizations. That makes them very powerful in a situation like this. While they could not single-handedly remove the GNCC from USA Curling, they certainly had the power to single-handedly save the GNCC because their votes alone, as long as one other member somewhere voted in favor of not removing the GNCC, would have been enough to avoid a 2/3 majority, which was necessary to sustain the removal of the GNCC. It's unclear what the Athletes Advisory Council gets out of removing the GNCC as a member region, but there is definitely a lot of concern that because many of the athletes that are represented or who really take part in the AAC are high-performance athletes that get their funding directly from USA Curling, that their votes aren't as independent as they should be. Whether or not that's the case, I can't say for certain, but that was definitely something that was a large point of discussion throughout the curling community, particularly from GNCC members and those who were not happy with this action on social media in the last couple weeks. Again, though, it is worth noting that this is not a USA Curling thing. They did not cause this to be the case. In some way, shape, or form, there would be an AAC that has a third of the vote. That's just a legal point right now, and in a certain sense, makes sense, right? Whatever you want the exact number to be, having a outsized vote for athletes who have a real stake in the organization and the sport does make sense. I understand why it has become the law that that is the case. But in this case, it led to a lot of confusion for a lot of people. And a lot of people were very upset with how the AAC voted. So now, in a vacuum, and pretending there were no other issues with USA Curling, and that outside of this dispute, everything else was hunky-dory, and we were all happy with how USA Curling was managing the sport. As much as there was a lot of heated rhetoric about this, it would have been mostly an administrative issue. Again, even the GNCC makes sure that clubs and members understand this. No club or member was expelled from USA Curling because of this action. Clubs will have to make a decision in January as to whether they want to stay in USA Curling. But they would have made that decision one way or the other anyway if they were GNCC clubs, because the GNCC was also allowing clubs to do that without losing their GNCC membership. There would have been real consequences, particularly for competitive curlers. And by competitive curlers, I do not just mean the people going to the Olympics or attempting to play at men's and women's nationals. Keep in mind that competitive curling in the United States exists at many different levels now. We have, along with mixed doubles as well, we have 4-player mixed curling. We have our club national championships. We have junior and senior events. We have arena national championships. We have a 5 and under national championship now. We have our college curling program. And all of these could be impacted if suddenly some clubs were or were not USCA members, USA Curling members, I should say. And if there were no longer GNCC playdowns, or if GNCC clubs could no longer host events. But the truth was that all these issues could have theoretically been worked around. Again, imagining a USA Curling that you enjoy and trust, there does seem to be some legitimate effort going into putting together at-large events in the categories of curling that need them. So, and all indications are that the attempts will be made to put these events on the East Coast, at least according to Dean Gemmell, who on this issue, I don't think any of us have any reason to distrust. And that would give, as long as clubs stayed within USA Curling, would allow curlers a fair opportunity to get back to these national events. Whether or not that would work out perfectly or even adequately is an open question, but the potential was there. And this had the potential to be only mildly disruptive instead of extremely disruptive. However, this did not happen in a vacuum, because the Jeff Plush issue is real. And the number of clubs that are not going to want to be USA Curling members is going to be way higher than it would have been a couple months ago. But let's get back to that as we head towards the end of this meeting. Over the last few agenda points, we looked at proposals by the Orlando Curling Club, which included a proposal to move to a true individual membership model instead of making things club-based. Individual memberships are sort of available now, but you still don't have access to USA Curling National Championship events unless you are a member of a member club. So this would turn this into a true individual membership model where individual members dealt directly with USA Curling without clubs or especially regional organizations serving as middlemen. These proposals were referred to committee. And to be fair, after a short discussion, even Orlando's delegates who brought up this said that was fine with them, given what appears to be a composition of a committee that would include members, the delegates who brought it up, some board members, of course, too, and athletes, and so on. But they were okay with that. So we moved on fairly quickly from that, as it was. There was a lot of sentiment from clubs inside and outside the GNCC that they found these proposals interesting, but didn't really have enough time to really analyze what their impact would be, and that it might be helpful to have a committee look at it and make some reports on what the impacts would likely be before clubs wanted to vote on them, which was fair, and everyone kind of agreed to that. A rare point of civility and agreement in this meeting. There was no old business to speak of, which moved us on to new business, which many of us thought would be the highlight of the night. Because, of course, new business is where we thought that the clubs and delegates who wanted to push for the removal of Jeff Plush would get their say. Sure enough, one of the first proposals to come up was a non-binding resolution that would reflect the will of the USA Curling membership that they wanted Plush to be removed. The reason it was worded this way seemed to be because the General Members Assembly each year does have a certain purview of categories of topics that are supposed to look at. And it did seem that actually removing Plush would be outside the purview of the General Members Assembly. However, many delegates brought up the fact that making a non-binding resolution would not be outside the purview, because it would reflect member will and be related to improved communication between the USA Curling Board and members, among other areas. However, the chair struck down this motion as being out of order and inappropriate for the meeting. A similar motion that would have had the board release its investigation of Plush to the public or to the USA Curling public was basically taken under advisement and then not voted on or discussed at all. At this point, it became very clear that the strategy of the USA Curling Board was to avoid any discussion about Jeff Plush, the Yates Report, or his position as a leader in the sport and as a contact point for safe sport in this members' assembly. So after a few points of new business were acknowledged, the chair abruptly adjourned the meeting. And you can see how that looked right here.
Is there any further business to come before this members' meeting? Because if there is none, this meeting will adjourn. Okay, who is the hand? Okay, thank you. So if there's none, this meeting will adjourn. This meeting stands adjourned. Thank you, folks. Thank you for staying with us this evening.
While this was happening live, many of us were under the impression watching on YouTube, or for those in the meeting, that there were many delegates who had their hands raised in teams wishing to speak on new business, and that the chair basically railroaded the meeting to an end. On further review, and if you watch that, it does look like it was just a handful, but that's enough. The fact that anyone had a hand up and wanted to speak should be enough to stop the meeting from being adjourned. There was no motion to adjourn the meeting. There was no debate or discussion over ending the assembly. It just happened. It was over, and no one was able to speak after that point. And so a 4.5-hour meeting came to an immediate end, much to the satisfaction of nobody. I understand the meeting went long, but the fact that we're kind of tired and we don't really feel like doing this anymore is not sufficient reason to end a meeting, especially when such important topics are being discussed. There was also a feeling that the attitude of the chair and the board throughout the meeting was one of derision and contempt towards the membership. It's hard to say that every single thing that was overheard or seen was in relation to feelings about what was being discussed or the membership, but there were enough instances of either looks or overheard dialogue from the board before the audio was cut off when they muted, that it was hard to escape the impression that they just didn't want to have to deal with this. There were also questions brought up about whether or not these muted discussions between the board were appropriate or within the rules of the meeting. I can't speak on that, but it was a point of discussion for sure. And I'd like to say, as much as this meeting was long and a bit of a slog, 4.5 hours isn't like an all-day meeting, especially considering the importance of the issues being talked about. The fact that that was considered the breaking point where we just couldn't talk anymore is kind of absurd. It was late, but not absurdly late. In the central time zone where the board was located and many of the members were located, it was still before midnight. Again, I'm not pretending that's not late, but when you go into a meeting knowing there are going to be some very serious issues discussed, the rush to cut off the meeting just did not make sense. And so that's where we were left after the USA Curling Members Assembly. Since then, there's been a lot more activity on social media. USA Curling hasn't released anything except for that recap statement, which you can now see was a complete and comprehensive recap of a 4.5 hour meeting. Absolutely. No sarcasm whatsoever. Since then, however, there has been a lot of activity on social media involving curling clubs and individuals across the country in reaction to this meeting. There continues to be an increasing volume of clubs that have called for Flush and or the board of USA Curling to be removed from their jobs. And at the very least, many of these organizations have said that they want the board to make the results of their investigation into Jeff Plush public. In one surprising development, Irvin Mossberger, and I apologize if I've pronounced your name wrong, of the Wisconsin State Curling Association, announced that he is going to hold their club playdowns. Those would be the events that would determine a winner who goes on to the Club Nationals Championship, as its own event that will crown state champions and will not send a winner to the USA Curling event of Club Nationals, based on what's been going on, based on the removal of the GNCC and the Jeff Plush situation. As he says in his statement, which I will link, there's still the possibility of playing against other state and regional organizations, including the GNCC, but that this would not be held under the purview of USA Curling, at least at this time. And there has been a lot of chatter from individuals, whether or not they represent the will of their clubs in total, talking about the possibility of clubs that are interested in leaving USA Curling because of what's going on, joining the GNCC, even if they aren't in the traditional geographic borders of what now constitutes the Grand National Curling Club. To be clear, the Grand National Curling Club has shown no interest at this time in becoming a national governing body, and it is not set up to do so at the moment. However, it also has no strict geographic borders for membership, and it does appear that there very well may be some clubs from other regions of the country who look into applying for GNCC membership rather than being a part of USA Curling. Obviously, this is still a developing situation. We don't know what's going to happen in the weeks and months going forward. And I'm sure I'll be back with more recaps and more updates on what's happening with the USA Curling, with the USA Curling Board, with Jeff Plush, with the Grand National Curling Club. And going forward, I'm sure I'll be back with more videos that discuss how this affects curlers at many different levels, from brand new curlers doing things like college curling and 5 and under curling, to competitive curlers who want to go to men's, women's, mixed doubles nationals, or slightly less competitive events like club nationals. There will be fallout from this, obviously, and we don't really know what that will look like in totality yet. We just don't. Anyway, thanks for sticking with me through this entire video. This is where we stand now. This, as I put in a tweet I made, this is USA Curling now after seeing that meeting. It's not a pretty sight. And there are a lot of us throughout the curling community who are very unhappy with where things stand now. If you want to see more from me, This is not the typical kind of video I do. I do a lot more on curling strategy, especially for beginners. But I do cover curling news like this as well. Hit the subscribe button, like the video, do the whole notification thing so you can keep up with when new videos come out. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon.